Welcome. This is the Warning Woods Halloween Special 2022, The Exorcism of Ridgeville. This is part 1 of a 5-part mini-series. Be sure to listen to each part of the story in the order they are released. This story will reach its terrifying conclusion at midnight on October 31st, Halloween. Without further ado, here is The Exorcism of Ridgeville, Part 1. My taxi driver made good time between the airport and the quaint little town of Ridgeville. I was happy to learn the driver was a chatty fellow who liked to answer questions as much as I liked to ask them. I gained all sorts of trivial knowledge about the little town I'd be living in along the way. I remember him saying something along the lines of, "People don't usually care to hear about old Ridgeville. I'm sure you'll learn pretty quick this is a quiet place for quiet folk." "That doesn't bother me one bit," I told him. "I could use some quiet in my life." Ridgeville sits between 2 large hills. I wouldn't call them mountains, but some might. They make the whole town feel like it's being kept in the earth's pocket. The hills create a feeling of isolation that is not unpleasant. At least, it wasn't unpleasant that day while driving to my new home. Just outside of town, we passed a huge cemetery sprawled at the base of the North Hill. A spiny black gate enclosed the graveyard, and a stoic brick building sat beside it. "That's a lot of graves," I said. "Oh yeah, don't worry, we don't got that many people dying out here in Ridgeville," the driver said. "So where do they come from?" "All over. The funeral home is one of this town's biggest businesses." He pointed to the stoic brick building. "People from miles away arrange to have their loved ones buried here by the hill. Can't blame them. It's a nice spot to come visit. It's gotta beat those eerie municipal cemeteries in the city." We took a left at a rare stop sign and entered the downtown area. I smiled. The town already felt like home. There's something about a historic downtown that makes me feel nostalgic for a time before my mother even thought of me. It was getting late, and I only saw one person on the sidewalk, a dirty, shriveled man. He rested on 2 mismatched backpacks against a bank's wall. He was drinking discolored water from a reused plastic bottle. If I had followed my gut instincts, I would have turned away from that man and pretended not to see him. Instead, I fought this reaction and studied the grubby man as we passed by. As if reading my thoughts, the driver said, "That there's Sam. Some call him Uncle Sam as a sort of joke, you know." "What do you know about him?" I asked. Not much," the driver replied. "I try not to get too close, know what I mean? I don't mean to be cruel or nothing, just never got a good feeling from old Sam. He sorta gives me the creeps. Think that makes me a bad guy?" "No," I answered slowly. "No, he gave me a weird feeling when we passed him too." We exchanged pleasant farewells as the driver dropped me off in front of my new house. I made sure he noticed how well I tipped him because he seemed like the kind of guy I might run into at a bar or a diner. Since he was also a talkative guy, and potentially a gossip, I thought he would be a good friend to have as I got myself synced up with the town. I'd done plenty of research on Ridgeville, but there are certain things about a town you can't find online. Some things you have to learn by diving headfirst into the deep end. "What was your name again?" I asked him. "Bill," he told me. "And yours?" "Patrick." "Well, Patrick, I'll be seeing you around." With that, he left me standing in front of my new home. I was fully settled in by the end of that week. I'd gotten unpacked, filled the fridge and pantry, and got all my entertainment set up as well as my office. The entire time, that homeless man, Sam, kept intruding on my thoughts. I couldn't explain why, then, or even now, why the filthy stranger remained so prominently fixed in my mind, but I thought of him several times per day. I made up my mind to go talk to him, but continually put it off for another day, then another week. Finally, on a rainy afternoon, I gazed blankly through my rain-speckled office window and thought of Sam out in the weather. Since he was already on my mind, I knew I wouldn't be able to forgive myself if I didn't so much as check on him. So I grabbed my jacket, wallet, and keys and got in my car. 3 minutes later, the bank sign came into view through the drizzle. Sure enough, I saw Sam propped against the wall near it just as he had been the day I arrived in town. I pulled up to the curb on the wrong side of the road, cracked my window, and shouted, "How about a hot meal?" I'll never forget the way Sam looked at me when I called to him through the rain. His reaction made me wonder if I had been the first person to talk to him in months, maybe years. He looked like he didn't believe I could be talking to him. He pointed at himself and I gave an affirmative nod. He didn't smile or give any indication he understood. He just got up, left his belongings, and walked over to the side of my car. "You don't have anywhere to go?" I asked once he was situated in the passenger seat. He didn't speak but shook his head no. "Well, I'm new to town, but I did see there's a nice-looking diner over on 5th. Ever been there?" I asked. Again, he shook his head. I put the car in gear and made a left onto 5th. The diner was well lit and inviting. Even so, we were the only ones there when we went inside, besides the cook and one waitress. I ordered meatball subs for both of us. The waitress seemed uneasy around Sam and quickly jotted down our order before disappearing into the kitchen. We didn't see her again until she returned with the food. Then, she disappeared again. "Listen," I said to Sam as he bit into his sandwich like an animal. "I'd like to know about you. How you got here, how you ended up, well," I didn't mean to sound insensitive, but I was truly curious. Sam didn't seem put off, thankfully. He grunted, "Why?" I told him, "I'm a writer. Right now I'm working on a book full of stories from interesting people in small towns, rural areas, anywhere off the beaten path really. I'm thinking of calling it Hidden Gems." At the mention of my working title, the man smirked. "What, you don't like it?" I asked, mostly just trying to get him to converse. "It's a little contrived," he said. I was shocked to hear a word like contrived come from a man like Sam, let alone used correctly. "I suppose it is," I said, laughing. "What would you recommend?" "Well, what kind of stories are in it?" he asked back. "Yours would be the first," I told him. Sam seemed to consider this seriously as he took his next bite. I got excited, thinking I had stumbled upon a gold nugget for the book. "Sorry to disappoint, but I've got no story," Sam said. I prompted him to explain how he had gotten to Ridgeville, how he had ended up on the street, why he stayed near the bank, etc. But Sam continued to eat his sandwich in silence. When he finished, he started fiddling with an old watch on his wrist. "Does it work?" I asked him. He jumped like I had scared him. He covered the watch with his hand and pulled his arm toward his chest. I raised my hands like a surrendering soldier. "I like you," Sam said unexpectedly. "You act like a good person, but you've got selfish motives behind your good deeds. You don't even try to hide that, do you?" His words took me aback. There was no sarcasm or hostility in his tone, just curious observation. And I had to admit, he was right. "I thought so," he said. He turned his wrist and unlatched the watch. He held it over the table, saying, "I want you to have this." I tried to refuse, but he insisted I take it. He said he felt guilty he didn't have a story for me and wanted to pay for his meal this way instead. I graciously accepted the watch and offered to drive him somewhere where he could take shelter from the rain. "Oh, I'll be all right," he said as he slid out of his booth. With his back turned as he walked away, Sam said, "You'd better start working on that book while there's still time." I was about to thank him when those last few words hit me. I turned to ask what he meant as the doorbell jingled, and he was gone. As I finished my own sandwich, I studied the watch. It had a cracked face and worn leather band. I couldn't find any brand or icon to indicate its make, so I assumed it probably had no value even when it was in good condition. I tried to wind it, but the gears made a pitiful clicking sound and the hands didn't move. On the back, someone had crudely inscribed the letters BLZBL. Too many letters to be initials, I thought. I tried a quick online search of the letters with no likely results. I figured the next time I was downtown, I'd just ask Sam what they meant. That turned out to be the following morning. I wanted to stop into the local police department and see if I could make any friends there. I thought the police might have the most interesting stories from Ridgeville if I could convince any of them to talk. On my way, I passed the bank and saw Sam's belongings drying in the sun. Sam was nowhere in sight, though. I pulled over and got out to walk around the block. I thought Sam might have just gotten up to stretch his legs or maybe seek out a meal. "You gonna take that stuff?" a high, mean voice asked from behind me. I turned to see a young blonde boy, maybe 11 or 12 years old, wearing cleats, shin guards, and a blue soccer uniform that said Ridgeville Riders. He had one foot perched on top of a soccer ball. No, I'm just looking for my friend," I told the boy. "Gross, you're friends with Sicko Sam?" he asked. "Well, we just met, but hey, it's mean to call people names like that, even when they're not around to hear it." "Whatever, man, I just wouldn't go calling that guy your friend around here." The kid started kicking his ball down the sidewalk, and my gut told me to let him go. It told me I didn't need to bother myself with a bratty, compassionless kid, but I didn't listen. "Why not?" I shouted down the sidewalk. I saw the back of the kid's uniform said Worthing 17. He spun around and shouted back, "Are you talking to me again?" "Yeah," I said. "Why shouldn't I call Sam my friend?" Worthing 17 kicked the ball to me, and I just barely caught it with the tip of my sneaker before it rolled into the empty street. I tapped it back to him when he was close enough that I felt confident in my aim. "You want to know why we call him Sicko Sam?" Worthing 17 asked. "Sure." "Well, he sits here all day and watches us like he's counting us. Kids, I mean. He always seems to know where we'll be and who we'll be with, and at night, if one of us is outside alone, he finds us and tries to take us into the woods." "Does he say what he wants to do in the woods?" I asked. Worthing 17 scrunched his face and scoffed. "What kind of grown-up are you? He doesn't have to. It's obvious. It's sick. And that's why we call him Sicko Sam." "Has he done this to you?" I asked. Worthing 17 shook his head. "No, but he's asked all my friends. They've all talked about it. I don't think he's done it to me because I know to stay away from sickos like him. I'm too smart and he knows it." "I'm sure." "I gotta get to practice. Good luck, I guess." Worthing 17 kicked his ball down the sidewalk around the bank where I lost sight of him. I wasn't convinced he was telling me the truth, but I made a note to keep my budding friendship with Sam quiet until I could learn more about him. If he was a known pervert, I think Bill, my cab driver, would have mentioned that. I pulled up to the police station 10 minutes later. An officer was near his open trunk checking some medical gear. He nodded at me as I approached. I asked if he had seen Sam that morning, and he said he hadn't. "The guy usually hangs out at the bank all day and night. We've always wondered if he ever eats or sleeps. Seems like he's always just there," the officer said. I told him, "Well, he's not there today." The officer shrugged and said, "Well, I need to get going, but I'll keep an eye out for him, all right? You a friend?" he asked. I told him I'd just met Sam the day before was all. I decided to drive around for a while and see if I could find Sam myself. It didn't take me long to cover most of the main roads. Unless he had gone inside someplace, Sam was really gone. And since he hadn't bothered to go inside during the rainstorm the day before, I assumed it was unlikely he was indoors now. When I pulled into my driveway, my heart skipped a beat. My front door was wide open, and some of my belongings had been tossed out onto the front lawn. Stupidly, I ran inside to see what had happened. I found most of the house untouched. My office had specifically been targeted by whoever came in. As I dialed 911 and looked around to see what was missing, I noticed Sam's watch sitting in the middle of my desk. It was just about the only item that hadn't been moved during the break-in. Welcome. This is the Warning Woods Halloween Special 2022, The Exorcism of Ridgeville. This is part 2 of a 5-part miniseries. Be sure to listen to each part of the story in the order they are released. This story will reach its terrifying conclusion at midnight on October 31st, Halloween. Without further ado, here is The Exorcism of Ridgeville, Part 2. After going over the house with the police, we determined nothing had been taken. There were no signs of forced entry. Someone had come in, somehow, torn apart my office, and then just left. The officer I had asked about Sam was there. He asked me if maybe I thought there was any link between the break-in and the homeless man. I told him I couldn't imagine there would be, but asked him to question Sam about it the next time he saw him. Once I got my office back in shape, it was as if the break-in never happened. I went about life as usual for the next few days. I made a habit of driving downtown every day to look for Sam, but never saw him. By the third day of his disappearance, someone had removed his belongings from the bank wall. The only evidence I had of the man's existence was the watch he gave me. I had started wearing it as a sort of good luck charm. It became a reminder to do good, and not just for my own motives. I started having problems during the next few days. The first nearly sent me to the hospital. I had poured myself a glass of water from the kitchen sink with the tap pushed all the way to the cold side. The water that poured from the glass into my mouth was almost boiling hot, though. I didn't notice the steam rising from the glass until after I'd nearly swallowed the scorching water. I played with the tap, trying to get cold water to come out, but all I could get was hot. I was able to get some cold water out of the bathroom sink, thankfully. My electricity became spotty as well. The house had frequent blackouts that lasted 1 or 2 seconds. There didn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to them. They just happened randomly. An important note before we go forward. I like to sleep with a white noise machine. It produces a constant static-like sound throughout the night to block outside sounds out. One night, I woke up to use the bathroom. I don't remember anything different from any other night except that when I returned to my bedroom, the constant drone of white noise was sort of pulsating, fading in and out in an inconsistent rhythm. I was going to unplug it and run it on batteries, thinking it was probably just another electrical problem. But when I bent over to grab the plug, I heard something underneath the white noise. A voice. It was deep, but sounded thin through the cheap speaker. Its words sounded purposeful, but I couldn't understand any of them. I didn't even recognize whatever language it was speaking. I told myself the voice must have been coming from some broadcast that got picked up by the machine, like when someone gets a metal plate in their head and claims they can hear radio stations. But when I pulled the plug and silenced the white noise, the voice continued to come through. I took the white noise machine out of the living room and left it on the couch. It had gone silent as soon as it was out of the bedroom. I went back to sleep without it, but not before tossing and turning for some time. I dared to put the white noise machine back in the bedroom the following night. To my relief, no voices came through the speaker when I turned it on. However, I woke in the middle of the night again. This time, it wasn't bodily urges that took me out of sleep. Silence did. Total silence that somehow seemed louder than the absent white noise. Another power outage, I thought. I stumbled through the house in the dark, wishing I had thought to put a flashlight by my bed. There was enough ambient light in the house for me to make it to the basement, but I stared down into total blackness from the top of the stairs. If I hadn't been worried about the food in my freezer, I would have just left the electricity off until morning. Not knowing what else I could do, I stepped down into the darkness. I felt around for the electrical box on the wall, nicking my finger on its corner. I slid my hand towards the latch and bumped into something else. It felt soft and warm. I retracted my hand and stifled a yelp. Then I convinced myself I was just tired and delusional. When I reached back out, my hand landed right on top of another hand that was holding the electric box shut. I screamed and ran back up the stairs, slamming the door behind me. Then I ran to the bedroom and grabbed my phone to call 911. I paused when I noticed the charging icon at the top of my phone's screen. Then I noticed the white noise machine was working again. I flipped the light switch and, sure enough, the electricity was back on. I cautiously returned to the basement door, opened it, and flipped the basement light on too. There was no sign anyone else was or ever had been inside the house. Had I dreamt the whole thing, starting with the power going out? It didn't seem likely, but I told myself that's what had happened anyway. I performed a quick sweep of the house, found nothing worrisome, and returned to bed. At first, it seemed the odd occurrences were only happening at night, but I started to recognize a more intricate pattern emerging. When I took inventory of each time the power went out or I felt something strange in the house, I realized each event was linked by one thing: me removing Sam's watch from my wrist. I had taken it off to wash dishes that time the water turned hot. I took it off every night before bed. I also had a habit of taking it off when I got hot because my wrist would swell and press against the band. I decided to do an experiment. When I finished a day's work on my book, I got up from my desk and removed the watch. I left it on my desk while I went about my usual routine. Almost immediately, something felt off. It almost seemed one side of the house had dropped about an inch. My steps felt uneven. I felt slightly off kilter, and all of this made me feel quite vulnerable. It was as if my body had fallen drunk while my mind maintained its faculties. The imaginary tilt of the house kept directing me back towards my office like my home was a giant bowl with the office at its center. At one point, I rested against the closed office door just to relax for a minute, but I heard something moving inside the room. It sounded like something hard scraping against wood, like something sliding across my desk. Maybe the watch. I turned the doorknob and nearly fell into the room. Sure enough, I caught the watch sliding on its own towards the edge of the desk. I ran forward and slammed my hand down on top of it. It was ice cold, and when I retracted my hand in shock, I heard a growl behind me. I spun around and saw the dark shape of someone crouching behind the open door. At first, I thought it was Sam hunched over and snarling at me. But as the creature stepped into the light, I saw it was a mangy, black dog. Its eyes were yellow, and its bared teeth were stained with blood. It watched me from the doorway, growling and slobbering. I felt like if I even breathed in a way the dog didn't like, it would rush in and disembowel me. I snatched the watch from the desk, ignoring its temperature, and shouted, "Is this what you want? Go fetch!" And I tossed the watch through the door. It bounced off the wall and landed somewhere down the hallway. The dog tore after it. I darted to the door and slammed it shut. Then I took a moment to catch my breath. As I rested, I listened. After a while of hearing no sounds outside the room, I poked my head into the hallway. The dog had vanished, but the watch still lay on the floor where it had landed. I slowly crept down the hall, peering around every corner and listening intently. But I couldn't see or hear the dog anymore. Something unnatural was happening, of that I was sure. And I was also sure whatever it was revolved around Sam's watch. I rubbed my finger over that inscription once more. BLZBL. I still couldn't figure out what the letters might mean. I strapped the watch to my wrist to prevent any further incidents as I got into my car and headed down the street. I had passed an old church numerous times and decided it was time to stop in for a visit. I pulled into the dirt parking lot, bouncing as my front tires hit the parking block. I shut off my car, got out, and nervously approached the door. Maybe it was my elevated blood pressure, but I could have sworn the watch band tightened around my wrist as I entered the church. "Hello? I think I need some help," I called out into the empty auditorium. It looked far more modern than the church's exterior, with heathered burgundy carpet, white walls, and cushioned black seats all in neat rows. I heard a door close somewhere, and soon after, the shuffling of feet. A short man in khakis and a green polo appeared in a doorway near the humble pulpit. "What can I do for you?" he asked. "I need to speak with a priest or somebody." "I'm no priest, but I am the pastor of this congregation. If you need something, I'm your guy," he replied cheerily. I introduced myself and gave him a quick summary of everything that had been happening. The pastor hadn't even noticed Sam's disappearance and offered a brief prayer for forgiveness for the oversight. When I finished, he asked to take a look at the watch. As I removed it from my wrist, he said, "You know, we aren't really big believers in cursed objects or witchcraft around here, Patrick. We tend to stick to more..." He trailed off as the watch fell away, revealing its underside. He snatched it out of my hand and stared at the etching with wide eyes. "Yeah, I'm not sure what that's all about," I said. His eyes slowly raised to meet mine. "Beelzebul," he said. I replied, "Yeah, BLZ, no," he said, cutting me off. "Beelzebul. A demon once said to have led a revolt against Lucifer himself." I stayed quiet. I wanted to laugh off the pastor's dramatic reaction. Was he toying with me? I half expected some televangelist-style sales pitch to come next, but I also couldn't stop thinking about that dog. Something, demonic or not, was certainly attached to that watch. Could it be this Beelzebul? I wondered. I asked the pastor if I could leave the watch with him since he seemed to know more about it than I. I hoped he might be more qualified to look after it. He said, "Yes, you'd best leave it here. I'll lock it up until someone with more expertise in this area can take a look. Are you a Christian?" I hadn't been asked that question by anyone but the occasional door-to-door evangelist in quite some time. "I was baptized in my teens, went to church on and off in early adulthood. I suppose I am. I've never really thought of myself as anything else," I answered. The pastor nodded quickly, as if my answer was exactly what he had expected to hear. "Got any crucifixes, rosaries, that sort of thing at home?" he asked. "Well, I have this." I pulled on a silver chain that ran around my neck and under my shirt. A little cross emerged from my collar. I had worn this necklace since my baptism nearly 14 years ago. Putting it on had become as much a habit as wearing underwear. It was easy to forget it was even hanging on my neck most days. That should work. For now. It could be what's protected you so far. I thought you didn't believe in cursed objects. Are holy objects different? I, at least, believe both God and demons will always find a way to do their work. That means that while most of the times humans try using curses or summoning demons and whatnot, it doesn't work. But it can. Supernatural forces just don't operate upon our whims. However, if a supernatural being such as a demon were to decide a certain human's actions provided an opportunity, it very well could take advantage. I'm not saying one way or another whether this watch is cursed per se, but if evil is at work here, I just have to trust God to counter it with his goodness. So keep that cross close. What's your name again? It's Patrick. Patrick Newell. Ah, yes, Patrick. I'll remember for the next time I see you, which I hope will be Sunday morning. With that, I went back home. Back to my quiet, peaceful, normal home. I spent the remainder of the day without incident and slept through the night, undisturbed. My peace may have continued through the next morning, too, if I hadn't turned on the TV while making breakfast. The screen showed the ashen lot where the church had stood the day before. Charred remains of its pious structure were all that were left now. A reporter was in the middle of describing a harrowing overnight battle against the fire, the cause of which was still under investigation. As I watched, someone knocked on my door. I answered it, still dazed, and nearly didn't recognize the pastor as he stood, sweating, dirty, and bleary-eyed on my front porch. His crisp khakis and clean polo had been replaced by gray sweats and a plain black hoodie that smelled like smoke. "Do you have it?" he asked. "Did the watch come back here?" "Come back here?" I echoed. "Why would it be back here? And how did you know where I live?" "It's gone," the pastor said, ignoring my second question. "It was in a safe box when I left it before the fire, and now it's gone." "Could it have burned up?" "Couldn't have. That box was designed to protect its contents against fire specifically. It was locked when I left, but open after the fire marshal brought it out to me." "Well, good riddance, right?" I said. The pastor's pale face didn't change. No, not good," he said. "Now that watch and the evil attached to it are out there again." He gestured to the world around him. "We aren't safe. No one is. Not until we find that watch and let the proper authorities destroy it." "Who would that be?" I asked. He paused, taking time to breathe. He looked like he wanted to answer but couldn't. Finally, he said, "I don't know." Welcome. This is the Warning Woods Halloween Special 2022, The Exorcism of Ridgeville. This is part 3 of a 5-part miniseries. Be sure to listen to each part of the story in the order they are released. This story will reach its terrifying conclusion at midnight on October 31st, Halloween. Without further ado, here is The Exorcism of Ridgeville, Part 3. The tragedy of the day wouldn't end with the church burning down. The police recovered Sam's body later that morning. He was naked and horribly burned from the neck down. Police Chief Redmond Stone held a press conference and announced there would be an extensive investigation into both the fire and Sam's death, but at that time, the department assumed the two were directly connected. The prepared statement the chief read implied that Sam had burned down the church as an act of meaningless arson and had fatally injured himself in the process. I went to the press conference with the pastor, whose name I learned was Isaac. The press conference was held just outside the police station. Isaac had been invited to speak, but had declined the offer. He told me he would rather deal with the aftermath of the fire privately with his congregation. We had hoped to learn more about the circumstances of the fire, but the chief and later the mayor were both incredibly vague. They made it sound like Sam, who had lived peacefully in town for years, had suddenly turned into a deranged criminal. The press seemed to eat this narrative up. All of their questions pried at how Sam burned the church down and not why. Isaac and I had a few questions of our own, but decided to wait until the official conference ended to ask them. The chief tried to vanish as soon as the mayor concluded the event. Luckily, Isaac had the foresight to start walking to the police station's side door as the last journalist was asking her question. Before the chief could grab the door handle, Isaac was saying, "Excuse me, sir." The chief turned toward us slowly. He looked exhausted. I had never considered how tiring it must be to stand up and answer questions for an hour. And that on top of managing an arson investigation in a small town where crimes of any sort are seldom committed. "What do you want?" he asked rudely. "I saw you two standing in the back over there. What's the deal? You can't watch the press conference on TV like everyone else?" "We just wanted to get a little more info," I said. "Well, I hate to say it, but I told the reporters everything I know." "That's not true," Isaac said. The chief grimaced and looked at his boots bashfully. He looked like a small child caught in a lie. I made a mental note to ask Isaac if the chief was in his congregation later. "Look, we knew Sam had been missing for a few days before the fire. I told one of your officers Sam had disappeared," I added. The chief snapped and pointed at me. "You were that author who just got into town. Your house was broken into," he said, putting everything together. "All right, I guess I can give you a little more info since you are technically part of this investigation." "I am?" "Not here. The underground, 7:30. Just you two. I am not going to have this conversation in uniform." The chief left us there bewildered. Isaac finally shrugged and said he should probably get to the church and deal with the insurance or whatever else needed to be done regarding the fire. I lied and told him I had plenty of business of my own to attend to, but I ended up at home binging The Office instead. It was a show I liked to put on like a blanket. It warmed and comforted me. I knew the episodes well enough to allow my mind to wander away and find its way back when it felt safe. I might have looked slovenly and bored to an observer that afternoon, but inside my gears were turning as my mind processed speculation after speculation on what the police chief might tell us later that night. Isaac and I arrived at the Underground, the lesser frequented of Ridgeville's 2 bars, promptly at 7:30. I had a habit of showing up exactly on time when I felt anxious about a particular meeting. I privately wondered if the pastor's timeliness was a symptom of his own nervousness. Together, we entered the bar through the door under its pink neon sign. Isaac looked visibly uncomfortable as he scanned the small crowd. Thankfully, but not surprisingly, he didn't see any members of his congregation. The chief stood up from a table in the back corner and came to meet us by the door. I almost didn't recognize him under his Chicago Bears baseball cap. "Keep your heads down," the chief said as he came near enough to be heard over the thumping bass line of the Red Hot Chili Peppers rendition of Higher Ground. His cap tilted down towards the sticky floor as he led us to the corner table. "Have a seat," he said, gesturing to the booth with its back to the door. He sat down opposite us under a green lamp. A quarter-full pitcher of beer sat in front of him in a puddle of foam. Once we were seated, he slid 2 glasses toward me and gestured to the pitcher. I emptied its remaining contents into 1 glass, which I shyly offered to Isaac. He held up his hand and shook his head, much to my delight. I pulled the glass back towards myself and took a long swig. Before my glass hit the table again, the chief said, "Now I want to stick to facts during this conversation. Is that clear?" Isaac and I looked at each other incredulously. "Under normal circumstances, I would wholeheartedly agree, but first, I'm curious why you feel the need to say that, sir," I said. The chief stared me down. I could feel disdain filling his booth, threatening to overflow across the table. "All right," he finally said, slapping his hand on the table in front of himself. "I'll probably regret talking to you two at all, but let's just see where this goes. For starters, I don't believe Sam was at the church when the fire started." "But you told the reporters," the chief interrupted me with a raised hand. I gave them a simplified narrative to run with. It wasn't a lie, but the whole truth is hard to believe. That's why I dragged you two out here instead of talking at the station. Oh, and by the way, if you try to run to anyone else with a word of this, they'll just think you're crazy, so don't bother." It sounded more like he was trying to convince himself than us. "Just tell us, Chief," Isaac said. The chief gave us each long stares in turn, then leaned back in his seat. "Just call me Red. I'm gonna need to abandon my official title for this conversation to proceed." Isaac and I agreed to this, although I didn't think it really mattered, and Red continued. "The witness who called 911 says the whole church went up at once. The whole building just..." He threw his hands in the air, imitating fire shooting upwards. "1 second everything's normal, the next, the entire building is in flames." "The fire department investigated this claim?" I asked. "The fire department, some of my guys, yeah, we looked into it. Trust me, I made sure they were thorough." "I'm sure. It was your church too," Isaac said, confirming my earlier suspicion. "So, did this witness see anyone go in or come out of the church?" I asked. Red shook his head. No, we asked if she saw anybody and she's pretty convinced no one went in or out." "So what? Sam could have gone out the back or something," Isaac said. "I don't think so," Red replied. "The only evidence Sam was there at all are the burns he had on him." "That's pretty damning evidence though, isn't it?" I asked. Red took a long swig from his glass, emptying it before he continued. "It would probably make this whole conversation easier if I just laid out the facts as we know them," he said. He folded his hands on the table, drew a deep breath, and began. "Call came in around 3 a.m. The witness told dispatch what I just told you about the church going up in flames. 6 minutes later, one of my officers gets there and secures the scene while fire starts showing up and works on putting the church out. They have the fire extinguished by 3:45, and we start investigating. At 4 on the dot, another call comes in. This one is from a guy up in the hills. Says he's found a body. We get somebody up there and figure out it's Sam. His arms are burned so bad we can see charred bones in his hands. His torso was blackened and everything else was charred pretty good. Creepier still, he was laying in the middle of a star he'd drawn in the dirt. There were a few little ash piles scattered around the star, so I'm guessing some other stuff got burned up too. It was like something out of a horror movie, you know? A watch, maybe? Isaac asked. I'm sorry, Red replied. Could one of the other objects in the star have been a watch? I clarified. Red squinted his eyes. I'm not sure if he was thinking or trying to read our faces in the dull, greenish light. Not unless it was made of something that could totally burn up. I'm telling you, all that was left was ash. So you think Sam started the fire, burned himself, and ran up into the hills? I asked. The chief shook his head. Not possible, he said. Where Sam's body was found is a 2-hour walk from the church, and that's for a normal, healthy person. If we assume he got burned in the church fire, that means he made that walk double time with his injuries. It just doesn't add up. What about the guy who found him? Could he have set Sam on fire? Or driven him up the hill? Maybe it's just a coincidence that Sam was killed on the same night the church burned down. That'd be a hell of a coincidence around here. No, I don't think so. The guy who found him is a hunter. He was out getting an early start. We did question him, no doubt, but he's innocent. He's far enough up in those hills he could have just buried Sam rather than call us to come get him if he didn't want us poking around in his business. Well, Chief, Red, sorry. Why don't you just give it to us straight? What exactly do you think happened last night? Off the record, of course, Isaac said. Was any of this on the record? The chief asked, raising an eyebrow at me. I raised my hand to show I was figuratively unarmed. If I ever write about this, I swear you won't even be mentioned, I said. Red nodded, but I thought I caught a hint of indignation in his eyes. I wondered if the closed-up tough guy we were being presented with was an act. I wondered if he might actually want a little attention. Well, his eyes flicked to me again. Off the record. I don't think Sam started the fire directly, but I still think he's responsible. Based on the scene we recovered his body from, I believe he was attempting some sort of occult ritual, and here the chief paused on the precipice of a crucial moment. He searched us both with his eyes, especially the pastor. He was looking for something. Trust? Maybe. His face didn't hold the stern hardness I would have expected from the town's top cop. It slowly dawned on me that Red was about to say something completely ludicrous, and what he was looking for from us was safety. Go ahead, Chief, I encouraged. We'll believe you. Red furrowed his brow and leaned all the way back in the booth, sliding a little sideways. Well, boys, I think his ritual actually worked. A pregnant pause lingered while Isaac and I processed this statement. Just to be sure I understand, you think Sam was able to set the church on fire from miles away with some kind of, magic? I asked. I tried to make sure I sounded curious but not doubtful. I think he took out that church like a sniper on a hilltop. Sorry, Pastor, I don't mean to be glib, it's just... No need to apologize, Red. I've done my grieving. It was just a building. However, there's one missing item that still bothers me. A watch. And we need you to be on the lookout for it. That's why I asked about a watch earlier. We think it's connected, I added. Sam gave it to me right before my house was broken into, and weird stuff kept happening at home after that. I gave the watch to Isaac for safekeeping because I thought it might have been... cursed, for lack of a better term. Red, that watch was in a fire-safe box and is the only item that went unaccounted for after the fire, Isaac reiterated. All right. A watch? Really? Just an ordinary watch? The chief asked. Isaac and I remained flat and serious. The chief shrugged and sighed. I thought it was silly of him to believe a dark ritual could burn down a church but draw the line at a cursed watch. Maybe he realized this too, because he leaned forward again and adopted a more sincere posture. This watch, what's it look like? He asked. Cheap, I said. Nothing special. Brown leather band, the face is cracked, it doesn't work. Isaac jumped in. Most importantly, it has an inscription in the back that looks like it was scratched with a knife or something. It's the letters BLZBL. All capital. Does that mean anything to you? Should it? Red asked. I believe it's shorthand for Beelzebul. The demon, right? The chief scratched his bear cap as he tried to remember an old sermon the pastor had given in which this particular demon was mentioned. Correct, Isaac said. And now it's my turn for insane theories. I believe Sam was an unwitting pawn in this demon's scheme. I don't think it is a coincidence that the church caught fire on the very first night the watch was being kept inside. I'm not sure where Sam got the watch, but I think he was instructed to give it to you, Patrick, and I think you were influenced to bring it to me. I think the demon Beelzebul needed to get that watch inside the church to burn it down. All that work just to destroy a little church in Ridgeville? The chief asked. Think about it. This is a small town. My church was the only one here. Without it, my faithful congregation doesn't really have a place to gather, to feel close to God. We're scattered unless I can figure out where I can gather everyone together. How would that help a demon? It's pretty simple, really. Imagine some type of violent motorcycle gang came to town and set up a clubhouse somewhere. Let's just say a warehouse on the edge of town. You and your cops need to capture these guys, but they're armed and dangerous. Would you charge onto their turf and try to arrest them on the spot, or would you try to separate them and pick them off one by one on your terms? Okay, I think I see what you're getting at, the chief said. This demon wants to waltz into our town without a fight. Exactly. So it separated all the people who might get together and pray it away or whatever. Basically, the Christians here will be weaker without each other's support. So now it's up to the three of us to fight it? The three of us sat silently for nearly a minute while Alan Jackson sang "It's 5 o'clock" somewhere through the overhead speakers. Red was right. We had to fight the evil. A writer, a pastor, and a cop. The duty had somehow landed on our shoulders. If I had stopped to consider it, I might have realized I bore no real responsibility, not on paper. I hadn't taken any oath to protect this little community of Ridgeville. I could have just gotten into my car and gotten the hell out of there if I had wanted to. Instead, I studied the other two men's faces. First the chief's, then the pastor's, and couldn't help but admire the courageous resolve I saw in their eyes. They were committed to doing battle, and something within me, some instinct I thought I had lost in the blurry transition from childhood into constantly buzzing adult life, said, damn the risk, damn the consequences. Let's do this. I downed the rest of my beer in one gulp and slammed my glass down on the table as I asked, so how do we fight a demon? This is Miles. I hate to interrupt, but this would be a great time to hit the like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I promise you won't regret it. Now, for the rest of the story. Welcome. This is the Warning Woods Halloween Special 2022, The Exorcism of Ridgeville. This is part 4 of a 5-part miniseries. Be sure to listen to each part of the story in the order they are released. This story will reach its terrifying conclusion at midnight on October 31st, Halloween. Without further ado, here is The Exorcism of Ridgeville, Part 4. My phone rang while I was watching the news the following morning. I knew who it was before I even picked it up. Have you heard? Isaac asked. I'm watching it now, I said. I've been with his mother all morning. I told her I needed to go to the bathroom. I had to lie just so I could have a second to call you. Do you think this is related to, you know? I stared at the TV screen, and a young, blonde boy, maybe 11 or 12, wearing a blue Ridgeville Riders soccer uniform stared back. The ticker read, Local boy Wade Worthing reported missing overnight. Search preparations underway. It was little Worthing 17. Maybe, I said. I met that kid once. Coincidentally, I talked to him right where Sam used to sit at the bank. He told me he and his friends called Sam Sicko Sam because he tried to lure kids into the woods at night. Wait, really? That seems like the kind of thing that would get around this community pretty quick. I don't think people would have been so tolerant of Sam if that were true. Who knows? Kids make stuff up, I said. But it's hard to ignore the possibility knowing what we know now. Well, hold on, Isaac said. Sam's dead. We know that for sure. This kid could have just wandered off and gotten lost. She hasn't said this publicly, but his mom told me they had a fight yesterday evening before he left. That eased my worry a little. With everything else going on, I had immediately jumped to the worst case scenario. It's like I forgot kids could run away on their own. I looked at the kid's smiling picture panning out on the screen and hoped that was the case. Patrick? Patrick, are you there? Isaac brought me back. Yeah, sorry. We should join the search party. Red will be coordinating it, I'm sure. I think the three of us should all be together out there. Good idea. I'll clear my calendar, I said. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Isaac asked, Was that a joke? Yes it was, at least an attempt at one. Probably not the best time, I suppose. I'll see you there. We met up at a trailhead where the police were organizing a search party. An officer handed us each an orange vest like one a hunter might wear. Isaac and I walked around the crowd to get around to the chief. He looked haggard. I'm guessing he was trying to manage a slight hangover as well as the growing search party. Oh, good. I hoped you two might show up, he said when he saw Isaac and I. You could have called us, I said. Yeah, been a little busy today in case you hadn't noticed. Sorry, what can we do? You two stick with me while we search. I'm gonna have the rest of this bunch comb the woods in a grid, but there's a spot I want to check personally. Let me guess. You want to check the spot where Sam was found? Isaac asked. Red pursed his lips and raised his eyebrows, silently recommending the pastor keep his voice down. Over the next 10 minutes, officers organized the crowd into duos and spaced them out evenly. They were instructed to walk straight through the woods and call out if they found anything. Ridgeville PD didn't have anything as fancy as whistles to hand out to the party. While the rest of the civilians were still receiving their instructions, Red told Isaac and I to follow him back to his car. We loaded into the back like a couple of drunks he'd picked up for bar fighting. Lose those vests, he said. I don't want anyone spotting us and asking why we're separated from the party. But you're the chief, I pointed out. Oh, you think that means I'm top dog, can do whatever I want? Listen, buddy, I still gotta answer to the mayor, the city council, even the friggin' education board if they see fit to ask what's going on. If anything, I'm under more scrutiny than the average cop, so we gotta be careful. He started the car and we drove around the woods to a gravel road leading up into the hills. It took about 5 minutes to reach a spot where I saw muddy tire tracks pointing various directions dug into the mud on the shoulder. This is it, the chief said. Why have the rest of the town searching the woods if you think the boy's up here? Isaac asked. Just in case I'm wrong, the chief replied. God, I hope I'm wrong. Sadly, the chief was dead right. Almost. I was the one who actually found him. We had stopped where Sam performed his ritual, but found the area empty save for a few stakes and police tape warning civilians like me and Isaac to keep out. However, someone had ignored the bold black words and had recreated the pentagram in the dirt. And something else. The 5-pointed star was darker than the rest of the ground. It looked like it had been recently saturated and hadn't yet dried. I noticed one point of the star overlapped the circle around it and touched the root of a tree. I followed the root to its trunk, and halfway up the trunk I spotted the rope. It was old and frayed, and a second pentagram was carved above its coils. With dread, I searched the tree's branches for poor Worthing 17's blue uniform. I realize now it was silly of me to assume he would have worn his soccer uniform to hike up into the hills and hang himself. I didn't find his body in the tree, though. Well, he was definitely here, I heard Red say. Or at least someone was, Isaac replied. I was too busy to participate in their conversation. I was walking towards the tree to investigate the rope. I still felt it was important. Turned out it was. The rope didn't run up into the tree branches like I had initially suspected. It ran back down the hill and disappeared into the leaves and brush on the forest floor. "Hey guys," I shouted back to the other two. They came running. "Is it him?" Isaac asked. "Maybe," I answered. I gave the rope a quick thwack and we watched it in silence. Its vibrations created a wide helix and slowly shrank along the rope's length. "Looks long," Red observed. "Might go down to the creek." Isaac and I shared concerned glances. The other two must have been weighed down by the burden of what we were all sure we were about to discover. They fell behind as I took the lead, following the rope down the hill, around trees and bushes. Soon, I could hear the water bubbling up onto the creek bed. Just as soon as I could see the creek, I found Wade Worthing. He was floating in the 6-inch deep creek with the rope tied around his neck. He was face down. I only recognized him from his shaggy blonde hair and the blue rider's uniform with Worthing 17 on the back, which he had actually been wearing when he ran out the night before. In the short seconds before the others caught up with me, I wondered if anything that had happened to me since I'd arrived in Ridgeville had been a coincidence. I had met Sam first and Wade second, the same order in which they had died. Wade had been wearing the same uniform in which he now floated before me, dead. And to the watch Sam gave me being inside the church the night it burned down, and I couldn't ignore the odds anymore. I decided in those short, quiet seconds, something bigger had been at work long before Sam had given me the watch, maybe even before I had come to town. Someone retched beside me and brought me back to the creek, the rope, the boy bobbing at the end of it. It was Isaac who had made the noise. When he steadied himself, Red came up to my side and asked, "You think it was suicide or murder?" "You were asking me?" I replied, involuntarily glancing at his badge as it winked in the sunlight. "I'm just thinking out loud. We can check this out for a minute, but I'm on duty, and there's a devastated mother wondering where her child is. I can't hold off on calling this in for too long." "I understand," I said. I slid carefully down the embankment and took off my shoes. I rolled up my jeans and started wading towards the body, thankful it was downstream. Red followed, but didn't bother to remove his boots or roll his pants. The body was stiff, bloated, and extra cold from the water. Its skin was gray and sort of translucent. "Can we roll him over?" I asked Red. "We really shouldn't disturb the scene, but..." Red winced and grabbed Wade's saturated uniform. He looked up at me expectantly, and I reached down and grabbed my own handful of wet fabric. Red gave a 3 count, and we turned the body over. Wade's eyes were open and colorless. His face was purple and puffy. His tongue had swelled, filling his mouth and forcing its way between his blue lips. Now it was my turn to retch. "Dispatch, this is the chief. I've got a body approximately 2 miles up Lorna Creek." I heard Red make the call, but I had otherwise disassociated from the present. Red's radio crackled and a voice said something to him, but it all sounded like noise coming through a wall. My ears started ringing and my vision shrank. I realized I was about to black out. I woke up laying on the hard plastic back seat of Red's police cruiser. All the doors had been left open to give me some air. I later learned that Isaac had noticed me looking pale and starting to sway, and had jumped into the creek just in time to catch me before I fell face first into the water. He and Red had dragged me back up the embankment. "No, absolutely not. Do not under any circumstances allow that woman up here," I heard Red say sternly. "Got it, Chief," a voice I didn't recognize replied. As consciousness slowly picked me back up, I noticed the hurried sounds of many people all around me. I sat up slowly and took in the scene. Uniformed cops were everywhere. Most of them appeared to be down by the creek where one was wrapping police tape around trees. An ambulance had backed up as far as it could toward the embankment. "Ah, good, you're awake," Isaac said. I jumped. I hadn't noticed him sitting perfectly still in the passenger seat up front. "How long was I out?" I asked. A while, at least 15 minutes, I'd guess. While you were out, we got some bad news. Bad enough for the town, but probably worse for us. What do you mean? There was a freak accident at the funeral home. It's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Honestly, it's like something out of a bad movie. Oh, for crying out loud, just tell me what happened, I snapped. There was a water main break near the edge of town. It flooded the street in front of the funeral home and overflowed all around it. Apparently, there was a sinkhole no one knew about right next to the funeral home. When the water came up and soaked the ground, it all just collapsed. The ground, the building, just gone. Took poor Bernice down with it. Who's Bernice? I asked. She was the mortician there. A sweet old thing. You'd never have been able to guess what she did for a living. Geez, I said. I processed this news for a moment. You said it was worse for us. What did you mean by that? Think about it, Isaac said. Sam burns up out here and my church burns down. Wade drowns and a freak flood takes down the funeral home. Patrick, I think the demon is making these people perform ritual sacrifices of themselves. I think he's using them to assault the town. Oh my God, Sam, I said. Isaac raised an eyebrow at me. His body, where would his body have been kept? Well, they would have taken it to the... Oh. Isaac went quiet as he came to the same realization I just had. Sam would have been inside that funeral home when it collapsed. I wondered if any of the bodies had been lost. Do you think it's trying to destroy the evidence? I asked. The driver's door opened suddenly and made me jump again. I guess I wasn't quite as conscious as I had thought yet. We gotta go, the chief said as he sat in front of the wheel. Wade's mother is causing a scene down at the bottom of the hill, and you two really shouldn't be here anyway. As we drove down the hill, Isaac filled Red in on the conversation we had just had. Okay, here's what we do, Red said. I'll deal with Miss Worthing. You two head over to the funeral home and check it out. There won't be much of a police presence there since I've got almost everyone up here dealing with the kids still. If you see anything worth worrying about, call me. Got it? We agreed to the plan. I couldn't look at Mara Worthing as we rounded the bend and came to the bottom of the hill. I knew my face would give everything away. Not that she needed another hint about what was happening. She must have already known her son was dead. She ran at the car and Red quickly got out to intercept her. Isaac and I took our cue and started walking back to my house to get my car. It feels quiet, doesn't it? Isaac asked as we entered town on foot. Yeah, I agreed. The already low energy of Ridgeville had seemingly dissipated, leaving perfect silence behind. There wasn't one car on the road or a single person out in their yard. Most blinds and curtains had been closed. Almost every door was shut. I wanted to shout out, "Hello, can anyone hear me?" But I was too afraid. I was too afraid there would be no answer at all. My car was in my driveway and I already had the keys in my pocket, so we got in and headed to the funeral home. I wondered whether the road would even be open and decided just to get as close as I could. The first person we came across was a public works man from the city sitting in the cab of his pickup. I pulled up alongside him and asked what the situation was up ahead. Road's closed down to one lane, he said. Half the highway's collapsed. You can go on ahead, but don't be surprised if they send you packing back this way. I thanked him and moved on. There was a fire truck and a single police car up ahead, and I drove on towards them. Not surprisingly, a young police officer stopped us as soon as we got close. She held her hand up until I came to a complete stop, then she approached my window. The road's not safe until we can figure out how big the sinkhole is, she told me. So, is there any way I can get out of town? I asked. You'll have to go back the way you came, up through the hills. Eventually you'll come to another road and can backtrack. But that'll take at least an hour, I argued. I know, sorry. I wish I had a better solution, but honestly, we're a little overwhelmed at the moment. All right, thanks, officer, I said, and rolled up my window. Why do you want to get out of town? Isaac asked. I don't, but now I know if I did, it would be a long time before I could get somewhere safe. You think that's by design? Has anything that's happened felt random to you? I asked, regrettably displaying my frustration to the pastor. Of course I think it's by design. It's killing people one by one, and now it's cut us off. You realize what this means, right? Medical aid, backup for the police, additional fire trucks, all of those things that were only 10 minutes away will now take over an hour to get here from the city." Isaac looked utterly defeated for a moment. I felt bad and was about to apologize for being too harsh when he perked up. "Do you see that?" he asked. I followed his gaze through the windshield and up the north hill. "Oh my God," I shouted. "That's the dog I saw in my house." We've finally arrived. Happy Halloween. This is the Warning Woods Halloween Special 2022, The Exorcism of Ridgeville. This is the 5th and final chapter of a 5-part mini-series. Be sure you've listened to the previous 4 parts before listening to this one. Without further ado, here is The Exorcism of Ridgeville, Part 5. The black dog was inspecting us from a rocky outcrop about halfway up the hill, maybe 200 feet from the ground. Isaac and I were too far away for me to actually see its eyes, but I could feel them. They were scanning us, threatening us, warning us to leave everything alone. Let things be. We couldn't just walk away. I know now as well as I knew then, but I can't tell you how badly I wanted to heed the black dog's warning. "Well, I guess this is what we signed up for," I muttered as I shifted the car into gear. "Patrick?" Isaac sounded nervous. He had every right to be. I must have looked like a maniac staring up the hill through the windshield, leaning over the steering wheel like I was trying to keep it from floating away. I floored the gas and the car roared, then lurched over the curb. We rocked back and forth as we rumbled towards the base of the hill over pockmarked dirt. "Patrick, you're going to get us both arrested," Isaac shouted over the bellowing engine. "By who?" I asked. The cops were all busy, and besides, I figured Red would just get us out again. "No one's following us up this hill, Pastor." I heard a siren wind up behind us. In the vibrating rear view, I watched a single police car spin in the dirt and start hustling in our direction. "Here they come. Get ready to run," I shouted. "What?" Isaac looked pale. I wondered if this was the greatest sin he had ever committed. In different circumstances, I might have reminded him that we were working for a good cause, but there was no time for comforting words as we rushed to the base of the hill. I slammed the brakes a few feet from the hill's craggy base. "Go!" I shouted and gave Isaac a strong push. I left my door open as I stumbled out of the car and ran toward the hill. My pace synced up with the car's dinging, an obnoxious reminder to shut the door. That sound faded away, and soon all I could hear were our footsteps and breaths and the rapidly approaching siren. Isaac and I climbed over the first batch of boulders and began the steep ascent through the thick pines that gave the hill its furry appearance at a distance. Up close, they were rough and harsh like wooden bullies. We used protruding roots as handles and footholds and managed to scale 50 feet or so before the pursuing cop got to my car. "Stop climbing and come back down. You're under arrest," the officer shouted as soon as he opened his door and got out. "Sorry, officer, we can't do that," I shouted back. I heard him curse and mutter something unintelligible into his shoulder-mounted microphone. I hoped Red would hear whatever message the officer put out and either tell him to stand down or go to our aid. I heard something coming down toward us and made myself as flat as I could. My first thought was of a falling rock tumbling down the hill, but a black, panting blur rushed by instead. It was the dog. Surreal relief came over me as it bypassed both me and Isaac and ran all the way down. I looked back and saw the officer still had his head tilted down towards his radio. I tried to call out to him, but it was too late by then. He looked up right before the giant black dog launched itself off the rocks and landed with a heavy whump on top of him. His throaty death gurgles lasted only a few seconds before his body went limp. The dog turned its dripping, bloody muzzle up toward us when it was finished. The smeared gore gave the grotesque impression of a grinning clown. It stepped off the officer's body, giving us a full view of his bloodied corpse. It looked like he had been nearly decapitated by the animal's savage jaws. The dog had completely torn out his throat. I figured we were next. "Climb!" I shouted, but Isaac was already moving. I had a feeling the dog was a much more proficient climber than us, but going up was our only option. As I climbed, I searched for a rock or a stick to defend myself with when the creature inevitably caught us. I finally saw a stone I could use off to the side and stretched to reach it. My fingers had just wrapped around the stone when a gunshot rang out and made me retract my outstretched arm. Dirt rained down on top of my head. A second shot sounded, and this time I heard a zipping sound before the dirt 2 feet to the left of me exploded. I was being shot at. I stole one quick glance down the hill and nearly blacked out again. The officer was somehow standing, the black dog at his side. His head hung limply to the left by his unsupported spine. His pistol was raised and pointed directly at me. The trees growing out of the hillside were far too small to hide behind. I could only hope demons weren't great shots and keep climbing. Isaac had gone a step further than hoping and had begun to beseech God for salvation. But as I resumed my climb, he followed suit. The next bullet stuck in a tree. The one after that exploded a rock between us. My hands were growing slick with sweat and I feared I wouldn't be able to maintain my grip much longer. "Over here," Isaac shouted out of the blue. I shimmied over to him and saw what he had found. The narrow mouth of a small cave was yawning at us from a jagged outcrop. Isaac slid into it first. Normally I wouldn't blindly dive into a small enclosed space, but a bullet struck the dirt 4 inches from my right hand and gave me all the encouragement I needed. The cave's narrow mouth had been deceptive. When I slid through it, my feet dropped down far enough that when they finally hit the ground, I was able to stand upright. Isaac and I both stood beneath the opening for a minute and caught our breath. "We should try to warn Red," Isaac finally suggested. He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen a few times and held it up to his ear. I could hear it faintly ringing, and then Red's stale voice saying, "You've reached Ridgeville Police Chief Red," and Isaac hung up. "He'll call back when he sees you called," I hoped aloud. Isaac kept his phone in hand and turned on its flashlight feature. He shone it into the cave. It had a throat which descended at a sharp grade into the bowels of the hill. It wanted to swallow us, and I wanted to let it, purely for the sake of survival. "Where do you think it lets out?" he asked. "I'm not sure," I said honestly, "but wherever it is has to be safer than here. We might have escaped the bullets, but this cave won't stop that dog." "Agreed," Isaac said, and slowly made his way toward the throat. Going down was much faster than coming up, but not necessarily easier. The stone esophagus had been smoothed by centuries of erosion. A glistening layer of moisture made its surface quite slick. Thankfully, there were a few stretches where the slick surface came in handy and we could simply slide down. Soon we were both down in the belly of the hill. I was surprised to see what looked like daylight up ahead, and to hear dripping water. "A way out?" Isaac wondered aloud as he pointed towards the light. I smiled and gestured for him to lead the way. I felt like we had slid down a secret tube in Super Mario and bypassed the danger above. My relief had given birth to a fat, slimy confidence baby that I was about to learn couldn't survive the cold, dark world inside the hill. Isaac and I crept toward the light. I kept waiting to hear the black dog following us, but it left us alone. Speculating as to why the dog had given up so easily made me sweat. I couldn't help but wonder if it had left us to a worse fate. A wide turn lay just ahead. We could tell the light shining down and across the cave floor was spilling from a source around the bend. "I'll go first," I told Isaac. He fell in line behind me, and we both hugged the icy wall as we slid around the curve. The dripping sounds were amplified the closer we got to the light. If we hadn't been underground, I might have thought it was raining up ahead. I took a few more steps before stopping abruptly in surprise. Up ahead was a splintered door, a crumbling brick facade, shattered windows, and the traumatized roof of the funeral home. Water was dripping down all around it from the edges of the sinkhole that had brought the building down into the cave. There were no lights on inside, obviously, but I was horrified to hear movement behind the walls. "Do you think she's still alive?" Isaac asked from behind me. "Who?" I asked. "Bernice, the mortician. They said she was inside when the funeral home went." "I suppose we have to check now, don't we?" I replied bitterly. Judging by the orange halo glowing above the sunken funeral home, the sun was beginning its trip to the other side of the world. Nighttime was coming, and I wanted to escape the cave before it arrived. "We'll be quick," Isaac said. "Besides, I bet all those cops and firefighters are still standing around up there. We can shout for help if anything goes wrong." "As long as they don't want to kill us," I said. "Lead the way." Isaac approached the door confidently, but then seemed to shrink against the funeral home's hollow presence. He shone his light into the darkness inside, but it barely cut past the welcome mat, which lay askew and folded over itself. "Hello?" Isaac murmured into the darkness. We both jumped back when a metallic shriek rang out. It was followed by a loud echoing clank. "Bernice?" Isaac called, sounding stronger now. At least now he knew there was definitely someone inside. "Maybe she's hurt and can't respond," I offered. "We should hurry," Isaac replied. "Follow me and stay close. I've been inside this building far too often. It's dark and crooked now, but I can still find my way around." The wet, uneven floor made our exploration precarious. It would have been quite easy to slip and twist or break an ankle. Isaac led me past the entryway into a sort of foyer where a coffin on rollers had smashed a hole the size of a truck tire in the drywall. The coffin itself now lay on its side with the bottom facing us. I involuntarily held my breath as Isaac approached the capsized corpse vessel. "It's empty," he said. I felt a moment's relief before he uttered a dismayed, Oh, but it hasn't always been." "Not now, Isaac. I really don't have the patience for jokes." Isaac turned to me, and the sunken corners of his mouth showed me he was most certainly not joking. "Come see for yourself," he said. "Those smears on the liner? That's foundation. Bernice puts it on bodies before a visitation to disguise their discoloration and make them more lifelike. But that's not actually the first thing I noticed. Look here." He pointed to a spot along the inside liner. There, easily seen in the flashlight's glow, was the imprint of a hand. Based on the size, it belonged to an adult man, not Bernice. "All right, Pastor, think. Who's died recently? Who should be in here?" "Well, there's Sam, obviously." Another scraping sort of sound echoed down the hall. Another clank punctuated it and chilled my blood. "It wasn't Sam. Sam died too recently to have been all dolled up, if that's even possible to do to a guy who burned to death," I whispered. Isaac and I were both staring down the hall where the sound had come from. "I think we have to go down there," Isaac said shakily. "No, we don't," I said. "We can leave right now. If we climb up the building, I bet we can get outside and—" "You just want to abandon whoever's back there?" Isaac asked. "Before it was Bernice, now it's whoever? Isaac, if it's not Bernice, then it has to be—" I was going to say a dead guy, but my tongue refused to even form those insane words. The very idea should have seemed ridiculous, but down there in that dark, damp funeral home, it seemed horribly possible. Especially having just been shot at by a dead cop. "Just go," Isaac said. "I have a duty to protect the people of this town against evil and evildoers. You've got nothing but a drunken pact to hold you accountable. Just go." We had made a pact, drunken or not, and I intended to uphold my end of the deal. I still thought the best option would be to leave the funeral home behind and get back to the surface, but I gestured for Isaac to lead the way down the hall anyway. He drew a long, deep breath and stepped forward. There was another loud scrape and a slam this time. Now we could pinpoint the noises. They were coming from a pitch-black room at the end of the hall to the right. I wanted so badly to ask Isaac what was in that room, but I dared not speak. Even a whisper, I feared, could alert whoever or whatever was in that dark room to our approach. Isaac stopped when we reached the black doorway, and I bumped into him. We were so close to each other, I could hear the whispers of his shirt rubbing against the wall as he shivered with fear. Someone was definitely moving around inside the room. They sounded slow and aimless, like an elephant in a zoo. Again, there came a scraping sound. This time, I could hear another sound beneath it. It sounded like small rocks tumbling down a hillside. The noises ceased momentarily, then repeated at double or triple speed and ended with a reverberating clank. Not rocks, I decided. Rollers. Wheels beneath a large drawer. Now it was my turn to shiver as I realized what kind of giant drawers could be found in a funeral home. Isaac put his hand over his light and slowly moved it into the doorway. Then, he carefully parted his fingers to allow a little light through. There were 4 of them, and 3 were naked. They all went still when the weak light brushed their skin. They were all colored by different shades of gray with dull blotches here and there. On the first woman, who I didn't recognize, purple spots were pooled around her eyes, mouth, and stomach. The next in line was also a woman. She was clothed and livelier looking besides a sort of yellow discoloration around her mouth. I assumed this was Bernice. The third was the friendly taxi driver who had brought me to Ridgeville, Bill. I nearly allowed a gasp to slip through my teeth when I saw him. He had a reddish patch around his chest and throat that looked like a cropped turtleneck. "I bet you didn't know he was dead, did you?" The voice of the 4th most horrifying body echoed my thoughts. I stumbled back against the opposite wall. I hadn't been able to tell whether this body had belonged to a man or woman until he spoke. His skin had flaked away from 90% of his body. His bones were like charcoal. His skull had one hollow socket and one with just a loose, withered eyeball. And his voice, the voice that had induced more fear than the body's appearance, belonged to the man I had shared a meal with one rainy day. The man who had given me the cursed watch and kicked this whole thing off. The voice belonged to Sam. As Sam stepped forward, Isaac told me to run. At the sound of Isaac's voice, the other 3 bodies awoke. Their eyes flashed as I spun around to run back the way we had come. We ran out of the collapsed funeral home, around the cave bend, and up to the steep slope we had slid down to escape the dog. "There's no way we can climb this," I said. "I know," Isaac said. We looked at each other stupidly for a second, then I searched the cave around us. Finally, I said, "Turn off the light and get behind that rock. Let's just wait them out." I pointed to a boulder about 5 feet away. We made our way to it before Isaac shut off the flashlight. "Maybe you should try the chief again," I whispered, while Isaac still had his phone out. "I don't have a signal," he replied. "Wait." I shushed Isaac and held my breath. I thought I had heard a commanding voice shouting in the distance. Then we both heard it. I couldn't make out what the man was saying, but he sounded scared. Then came the gunshots. Dozens of them. It sounded like a fireworks display popping off just above us. At first I was scared, then, as the last shots faded away, I allowed myself to hope. Had we just been rescued? We waited a few more minutes, but when the fresh silence lingered, we crept back into the open. Isaac didn't turn the flashlight back on, and I didn't ask him to. There was enough light coming in from the sinkhole to see where we were going without giving ourselves away. While we made our way back to the opening, I asked Isaac, "Did you know those other dead people?" Isaac cleared his throat and said, "I recognized 2 of them. One was a woman from my congregation. She always came alone. Her husband, well, let's just say he could have used the Lord's light in his life. This isn't the time to be vague, Isaac. What did her husband do? He was a drunk and a wife-beater. She always wore long, loose clothes to hide the bruises. Apparently, he took the abuse all the way this time. But you didn't hear about her death? I asked. It must have been in the last day or so. I've been so caught up with the fire, and you don't have to make excuses, I understand. I'm just trying to put everything together. I knew the other man. His name was Bill. He was a taxi driver. Yeah, I know. He was the type you only see at church on holidays, but he was such a friendly guy. I couldn't have forgotten him. So you think he was also killed recently? I asked. Isaac shrugged. We had reached the funeral home again and stopped to listen for movement. The whole world felt dead. On my lead, we scaled the lopsided building, climbing the collapsed roof, and reaching the precipice of the sinkhole. I pulled myself out and turned to grab Isaac's hand. The look I saw on his face paralyzed me. I had to read his lips. He made practically no sound as he mouthed, "Don't move." I heard a creaky popping noise behind me. Now Isaac screamed, "Duck!" I dove to the side and rolled over to see a police officer with a hole in his chest pointing his service weapon where I had just been. I crab-walked away from him and the hole and saw the rest of the emergency crew. Firefighters, waterworks, EMTs, and Bernice. All covered with copious amounts of blood, all with fatal injuries, and all with the same hateful energy filling their otherwise void eyes. The gun in the officer's hand went off. The bullet missed me by inches. 3 other dead officers raised their guns in my direction. I curled into a ball, making myself as small as I possibly could. I didn't know what else to do.
"Stand down,"
a commanding voice shouted through the radios attached to every emergency worker. Half a dozen undead heads turned to look at their radios as if they had never seen them before.
"I repeat, stand down,"
the voice shouted again. This time I recognized it as Red's. The reanimated cop nearest me seemingly decided to ignore the strange talking object on his shoulder and trained his weapon on me once again.
"That's it,"
the radio crackled. I heard sirens wind up as an engine roared just out of sight to the west. The chief's car rushed into view going 70, maybe 80 miles per hour. He hit the waterworks crew first, sending them both flying over the car. Red's light bar was damaged, but he kept coming. He flattened one cop and sent a firefighter flying before striking another. One firefighter and 2 EMTs later, the cop with his gun trained on me was the only demon zombie left. It was too late. Red had cleared the rest of the danger, but that gun was aimed right at my head and I had zero defense. I could hear the souped-up roar of the chief's car barreling toward me in a futile attempt at rescue, but I knew he wouldn't make it. I chose not to look into my killer's eyes, knowing I would not see a police officer, but a demon. Instead, I chose to look straight down the barrel of the gun, not giving Beelzebub whatever the satisfaction of seeing my fear. The cop was already squeezing the trigger when Isaac erupted from the sinkhole and grabbed his ankles. He went down hard. Red's squad car flattened his body a second later, spraying me with blood and little bits of soft, warm tissue. I didn't even notice. I had been expecting death and was simply stunned to still be breathing. Slowly, the veil that had descended upon the world around me lifted and I heard Isaac saying, no, shouting, my name, over and over and over. I wanted to throw up. But instead I laughed. I laughed so hard I fell onto my back. Isaac looked scared, rightfully so in hindsight, and that just made me laugh harder. I continued to laugh until the chief walked over, grabbed my collar, and smacked me across the face. Get up, he said. You're just dumping adrenaline. This is far from over. I collected myself and stood. The chief was looking out at the field of mangled bodies and muddy tracks. Tears filled his eyes as he growled, You wouldn't answer your damn phone. We tried to call, but we had no signal, Isaac said. It doesn't matter. We've already lost. What do you mean? I asked. Come with me, he said grimly. We loaded into his blood-spattered car. His wiper blades squeaked across the red-streaked windshield and got stuck halfway. With a grunt, Red sprayed wiper fluid on it and freed them. He had to repeat the spray wipe cycle 4 times before he could see clearly enough to drive. Even then, the sunset looked a little too red through the glass. Not that there was much of a sunset left to see. The sun looked like the tip of a fingernail slipping away between the hills. We were minutes from darkness when Red sped us back into town as if he was aggressively trying to capture that last bit of light. Red, there was a guy down there, a taxi driver named William Fetterman. Yeah, he was killed on the job last night. I just found out a couple of hours ago. He's a part of this now. Was there a woman killed too? Isaac asked. Not sure. She was from the city, I think. I didn't recognize her. You saw her? I asked. I hit her, and I think I stopped her. She almost got away with Bill. By then we had gotten downtown. The town felt lifeless. Not one person was outside or in the windows of any building we passed. The automatic street lamps supplied the only light as the sun made its final descent. Where is everyone? I asked. A lot of them are probably dead. Some of them have probably locked up and hidden themselves. The rest, they're probably going to bed with no idea what's going on outside. Chief, we don't even know what's going on. Are you going to fill us in anytime soon or just keep sightseeing? Red pulled over and killed his headlights. Then he unbuckled and turned in his seat to better face us both. My entire force has fled or been killed. Not that it was that big to start with. Were the rest... Did you have to... Isaac seemed to struggle with his question. Did I have to kill all my people? Is that what you're wondering? Red asked. Isaac nodded nervously. Most. Some still got away though. Now to be clear, they were dead before I had to put them down, like the ones who were just trying to kill you back there. I think their bodies are being used or controlled or possessed, Isaac said. Demonic possession of living people is a well-documented phenomena going back centuries, millennia even. However, I'm unaware of any incident where a demon took over a dead person. A whole gang of demons, I said. Well, not necessarily, Isaac replied thoughtfully. I'm wondering if this one, Beelzebub, who we already know has an unholy amount of power and a tendency towards breaking the rules, is able to control multiple human vessels at once if they're already dead. I'd assume it takes less focus and energy to power a corpse than to manipulate a living, willful person. Well, we can't exorcise the whole town, can we? Red asked. No, not me anyway. What about the watch? I asked. It's how he got Sam and almost got me, right? If I had kept wearing it, it probably would have been me laying face down in that creek instead of the Worthing boy. It's not a genie, Isaac replied. Demons aren't confined to objects the way you see in movies. They can certainly utilize physical items to concentrate their power, which is what I'm guessing happened with the watch. You said bad things happened whenever you took the watch off, right? Yeah, that was the pattern. And what did you do about that? Well, before I brought it to you, I just started wearing it all the time. It seemed to keep the bad stuff at bay. And that's what it wanted. You started wearing the watch like Sam, and it convinced you to bring it to me. But Sam burned down the church, didn't he? How was he still possessed if he had given up the watch? That's what I'm saying, Patrick. The demon doesn't need the physical item, it's just... Think about a magnifying glass in the sun. It doesn't create sunlight, it just focuses it and makes it stronger, more dangerous. By bringing that watch to me, you essentially pointed the magnifying glass at the church. When Sam, under the demon's control, performed his ritual, all that evil energy had a perfect target. If you're right, shouldn't the watch have been inside the funeral home? Red asked. Going along your theory, that was little Wade Worthing's target. Probably. I bet if we had searched in there a little longer, we would have come across it, Isaac said. Somewhere up ahead, a woman screamed. Her cries pierced the quiet outside and echoed off the still buildings. Red pulled his seatbelt back into place and put the car in drive. He left his headlights off, though. We said nothing as we rushed from block to block searching for the woman who had screamed. He's spreading, Isaac muttered. Hey, Red, do you have a loudspeaker on this thing? Yeah, Red replied absently. All of his attention was on the windows. "We need to get on it and warn everyone. Maybe we can still get the survivors out of here." "Be my guest." Red detached a handheld microphone from his center console unit and handed it to me. Since Isaac was in the back seat, I couldn't pass it to him. I pressed a button on the side and heard the loudspeaker squawk above us.
Everyone, get in your cars and get out of town. You are all in serious danger. Don't talk to anyone and leave now.
"There," Red shouted as he jerked the wheel to the left. He had seen a woman running for her life. He hit a switch and the world outside started flashing red and blue. The woman stopped running and a look of relief came over her. She waved us down as Red pulled up. "Get in the back," he yelled through his closed window. The woman ran around the car and opened the back door. "Come on," Isaac hurried her. She got 1 foot into the car before something grabbed her. She screamed bloody murder as she was dragged away from us, leaving the back door wide open. I heard a sick, wet crunch, and then the screaming stopped. Isaac shouted, "Red, we gotta..." He cut himself off with a choked shout as Bill, naked and bloodied, appeared next to the door. "Help me!" Isaac screamed as Bill tried to get inside the caged back seat. Isaac held him off with a couple of kicks, but it wasn't enough to keep the undead taxi driver out. "Hang on," Red grunted. He threw the car into reverse and floored it. Bill's feet went out from under him and his head splattered in the inside of the door. The car jolted as the front tire on Red's side bounced over Bill's body. Before Red could put the car back in drive, the other back door was opened from the outside. The screaming woman appeared again, with half of her skull bashed in. With inhuman strength, she pulled Isaac out of the car. Red and I got out simultaneously and rushed to his aid. The woman was already throttling him by the time I got my hands on her and tried to pull her away. Red went for her hands, struggling to open them so Isaac could breathe. His eyes were wide and reflected the flashing emergency lights as he stared at me, begging me to save him. I wrapped my own arm around the woman's throat and put all my weight into dragging her down. Red finally loosened a few of her fingers enough to get one hand off and she fell on top of me. Thankfully, Red thought quickly. He got behind the open car door and began bashing it against her. 3 blows were enough to knock her off of me. "Run!" he shouted. Isaac had already taken off. I started to follow, but then I saw Bill's body. He was laying with one arm beneath himself and the other outstretched. On his wrist, I saw the watch. "Go on, I'll catch up," I yelled. I crouched near Bill and started removing the watch. Then I heard Isaac and Red's footsteps stop. I looked up. The road was blocked by a wall of walking corpses. Sam was leading the pack. I recognized the waitress who had served Sam and I meatball subs among the dead, as well as others I had only met briefly during my time in Ridgeville. They were all walking towards us, closing in. I stood and Isaac and Red both turned to run the opposite direction, but that was also blocked by a stupefied crowd. This one was led by little Wade Worthing, number 17. The 3 of us huddled together, unsure of what to do next. "You have witnessed the beginning," Sam said in a deep voice that rattled the windows around us. "Give up now and I will spare you from having to witness the end." "All right, Pastor, you're up," Red muttered. "What do we do now?" Isaac looked back at Red's car, but Wade's group had already overtaken it. There were no doors on the sides of either building to our left and right. "Here," I said, handing Isaac the watch. "Can we use this?" Sam saw this and laughed. "Like a magnifying glass," Isaac mumbled. "What?" I shouted at him. "It concentrates the power. Sunlight. Reflection. A mirror. We can turn his power against him if we can redirect it back, but we need something..." Isaac spun around and reached for my neck. I shoved him away, assuming he had just been possessed. "No," he shouted. Your necklace. I need your crucifix." I didn't know what he was getting at, but I pulled my old necklace out from under my shirt. Isaac snatched it, pulling it hard enough to break the chain. He clutched the little cross and the watch together in one hand. "Lord, hear my prayer," he said loudly. "Show this demon your strength." Both approaching groups halted suddenly. Some of the bodies stopped in mid-step and toppled over. Others stood balanced for a moment before they too fell. Sam was the only one who remained standing. He seemed to grow. His physical stature remained static, but his presence increased, making it feel like he was looming over us. All of the demon's energy had filled his feeble body. "Let your light overpower this darkness." Sam raised a hand and a glow emanated from Isaac's palm. "Let your goodness overcome this evil." His prayer was punctuated by an anguished cry. His hand started to smoke. I clasped my own hands over his fist, keeping the watch firmly enclosed and pressed against the cross. The heat was nearly unbearable, even for me. I couldn't imagine the pain Isaac must have felt with the objects directly on his skin. Just when I thought I couldn't hold on any longer, Red clasped his hands over mine. "You will all burn in hell," Sam growled. He dropped onto all fours and opened his mouth wide. Black hair sprouted from every pore on his body. A wiry tail grew behind him. Before our eyes, he transformed into the black dog. All of our hands burst into flames. Red fell away. I stumbled back. Isaac collapsed. His hand hit the ground and opened. The fire leapt out of his palm, flew through the air, and hit the dog squarely in the mouth. Immediately, the flames turned a blinding white. We all had to look away as the animal howled in pain. By the time its cries faded away, the fire flickered and vanished. Where the dog had stood, nothing remained but the tiny steel cross. Not even ash. Even the necklace's chain had been burned up. We sat in stunned silence for what might have been a minute, maybe 5. Then Red laughed. The sound was so contagious I found myself joining in a moment later. Soon even Isaac was laughing with relief through tears of agony, but the laughter didn't last. At some indefinable moment, it turned to sobbing. We cried for ourselves, for our lost friends, and for all of Ridgeville. The final head count found that out of Ridgeville's 300 or so residents, only 24 survived, including Isaac, Red, and me. The other survivors had all locked themselves into their homes near the west end of town. Apparently, the demon scourge hadn't reached them yet when I had put out the message on the loudspeaker that had drawn them all back to us. Isaac lost his left hand to the burns. His right, along with my hands and Red's, recovered with time and critical treatment. There was a sweeping cover-up to ease the fears of those nearby and explain the deaths of so many people in a single night. The governor released a statement saying deadly chemicals from the funeral home had leaked into the water supply after the water main break had caused it to collapse. These chemicals were said to have been consumed by almost everyone in town, killing most of them. Those who know the truth have stayed quiet until now, out of fear of being labeled a lunatic or having the authorities shut them up. I'll admit, I'm not sure what will happen to me once I publish this story. But the reality is, whatever happens won't be worse than what would have happened that night if we hadn't stopped it. Now I'm just trying to tell everyone I can, to let them all know how we put an end to that evil. If you enjoyed this story, please leave a like and subscribe to my channel. You will get a new story every week if you do. If you feel ready, meet me here next week for another journey into the Warning Woods. Thank you for listening.